Hello, my name is Philip Totaro. I'm the founder and CEO of market research firm IntelStor. Welcome to your weekly dose of truth to power. Truth to Power examines data driven insights for the energy sector with a focus on renewables. On this week's episode, we'll take a look at a few recent examples of anti wind disinformation in Europe and what the industry can do to better educate the public on the underinvestment in grid and storage technology, which is really the problem. Last week in Britain, the electricity operator paid wind farm operators a total of £1.3 million in a single day for lost revenue after ordering them to switch off their turbines to avoid overloading the grid. It's what we in the industry call curtailment. And while that story has been repeated every few months in the UK, wind energy always seems to be the pantomime villain in the editorials written, when in reality, the poor grid infrastructure and underinvestment in energy storage is what's really to blame. Those curtailment payments are due to the way the power offtake contracts are structured, specifically so that the wind farm owners and operators are not unfairly punished for being too efficient, which is what they are. The payments are ultimately the result of Britain's out of date transmission network, which simply cannot cope with the amount of renewables being generated during times of high wind. It means that they can't operate the wind farms at full capacity because the grid doesn't have the capacity to offtake and move the power around safely to where it needs to go, industrial areas like Birmingham, Manchester, and London. So, the main reason for these curtailment payments to wind energy is a failure to build out the country's electricity grid fast enough. And in the meantime, National Grid is investing £35 billion in transmission lines over the next 6 years, including 3 subsea cables that are bringing electricity from Scotland to England. However, the challenge for them is that one of these projects is already running 16 months late and is not due to be completed until April 2029. In the meantime, the constraint payments are expected to continue and even to increase until at least that time frame when additional grid capacity comes online. So, how did we get here? Well, before 2010, the UK had a policy of what they call invest and connect, meaning that developers of power generation facilities had to wait until the energy networks were reinforced or expanded so that they could effectively and safely connect. And while that sounds sensible to a lot of people, that was a bad policy, frankly, because it forced delays on the developers of the power generation plants that caused some projects to become economically unviable if they couldn't lock in a lower interest rate on their cost of finance. Ed Miliband, who was the energy secretary at the time, moved the country back in 2010 towards a system of what they call connect and manage, meaning that the wind farms could connect even if there wasn't enough capacity, but they would have to be curtailed from time to time, and these constraint payments would be enacted and the cost would be spread out over all the ratepayers. Now, that was a decision, both a political and just an operational decision that they took, because if we can take the politics out of the conversation for the moment, the decision actually ended up making things cheaper for British electricity consumers, even though it introduced these constraint payments that none of them like and all of them have an opportunity to rail against every time one of these articles gets written. I can appreciate that it's certainly frustrating to see power being wasted, and unfortunately, politicians have also turned this into a wedge issue with voters, putting the blame on wind energy, when in reality, wind is operating efficiently. According to IntelStor's own analysis, the £1 billion in annual constraint payments that are made to wind energy power producers equates to approximately £34 per household for the average number of ratepayers throughout the UK. The wind farms that have been installed in the UK have largely displaced coal power plants, which would cost upwards of £15 to £18 per megawatt hour to operate if any of them were really still in major operation today. That compares to £5 per megawatt hour for the operation of wind energy and £2.34 per megawatt hour to operate natural gas plants. So the bottom line is there are cheaper alternatives available to what they would have done, even though they have these constraint payments. And had they not done this, those same ratepayers would be spending almost 4 times that £1 billion per year to leave old coal plants online, amounting to £3.8 billion in coal operating costs instead of the £1 billion in wind energy constraint payments. Now, I mentioned at the start of this episode that on October 1st, Britain's electricity operator paid wind farm operators £1.3 million in compensation for lost revenue. The other problem here is that on top of that, the grid operator was also forced to pay £4.9 million to buy energy from abroad and switch on expensive gas peaker plants in order to meet demand in places like London. So, how could that have been avoided? Well, let's look at energy storage as a possible solution. The average energy storage costs in the UK are £580,000 per installed megawatt in CapEx cost, and the operational costs are an additional £2.50 per megawatt hour. Therefore, give or take about 6,000 megawatt hours of storage would have actually facilitated offtake of almost 100% of the wind power that ended up being curtailed on October 1st. That would have eliminated the £1.3 million in constraint payments and negated the need for insourcing the £4.9 million of energy from abroad or using the gas peaker plants at all. All of that with storage would have cost substantially less than the £6.2 million that they ultimately spent. Now, it's certainly my contention that the country is better off with wind, despite these constraint payments that, again, we appreciate in the industry that they're a pain in the backside. But if ratepayers want to eliminate those payments, they need to lean on politicians and the utilities to install more energy storage, which will reduce that wasted wind down to almost zero. That's the best stopgap measure that can be quickly put in place until the grid improvements come online towards the end of the decade. Now, in another unfortunate publication late last week, the University of the Hesperides in Spain released a report saying that renewable energy penetration has failed to reduce the price of electricity for households in the country. It was 72% more expensive at the end of 2024 than electricity was back in 2007, which is technically accurate. However, they neglected to mention the fact that with all the renewable capacity additions, the price of electricity was actually reduced below the 2007 levels as of 2021. The reason for the price spike in 2022 was due to the Russian Federation's illegal invasion of the Ukraine, which resulted in a merchant market price explosion driven by the constraints in natural gas supplies. So, renewable energy will remain the energy sector's best weapon against rising costs globally. If we get the politically influenced anti wind disinformation campaigns out of the public's consciousness, or at least provide enough information so that people can fight back with facts, the world will thrive with abundant and cheap electricity. Thank you for joining me this week. I'm Philip Totaro, and this has been your weekly dose of truth to power. Follow us on IntelStor's YouTube channel as well as your favorite audio platforms, and visit www.intelstore.com to join more than 200,000 subscribers to our renewable energy data solutions. A full analysis of the renewable energy markets in the United Kingdom or Spain is available to subscribers. And this is your last chance to register for the upcoming Wind Summit event in Houston, Texas. Visit www.windsummit.org and join hundreds of your industry colleagues from companies such as NextEra, EDPR, EDF, Pattern Energy, Clearway, Apex Clean Energy, and more. We hope to see you there.